Have you ever heard someone say this? Or, maybe you've even said it yourself. The line usually goes something like, okay, so humans are related to monkeys and apes, but we aren't descended from monkeys, right? It's just that we share a common ancestor. It is easily one of the most widely repeated statements about human evolution out there. You usually hear it offered up by well-meaning people who are just trying to defend evolutionary science. I actually pulled this exact quote from a popular Reddit post discussing common misconceptions. And honestly, it sounds so reasonable, doesn't it? It feels like the smart, scientifically accurate thing to say. But here is the shocking truth about that statement.
Wrong. Absolutely, emphatically, 100% wrong. I absolutely love the passion here. This is the direct response given by paleontologist Dr. Thomas Holtz on that very same thread, and it completely shatters this cozy little myth we've all been comfortably repeating.
The monkey ancestor myth and the genetic mystery of humanness. Let's dive right into this explainer and uncover our true evolutionary ancestry before we go searching for the genetic needles that actually make us human. So it all comes down to this biological term called a paraphyletic series. Basically, this means a grouping that includes a common ancestor, but then arbitrarily leaves out some of its descendants. The terms monkeys and apes, as we use them in everyday life, are totally paraphyletic. And here is exactly why that matters. Old World monkeys are actually more closely related to apes and to humans than they are to New World monkeys. Because of how the evolutionary branching works, if you trace our specific lineage all the way back to the common ancestor of apes and Old World monkeys, that creature would be considered a monkey by any reasonable definition. Therefore, humans absolutely are descended from monkeys. This really highlights the massive disconnect between everyday language and actual taxonomy. In casual conversation, when we say the word monkey, we specifically mean the animals with tails, right? We explicitly exclude apes and humans. But biologically speaking, doing that creates a broken, inconsistent family tree. A much better taxonomically valid proxy for the word monkey is simians. The simian group correctly encompasses New World monkeys, Old World monkeys, apes, and yes, us humans. We are undeniably part of the monkey branch of the primate tree. Now, if you've ever read an article about human DNA, you have probably heard the famous trivia fact that humans and chimpanzees are 99% identical, or just 1% different. Well, according to the incredibly comprehensive genomic analysis by researchers Varkey and Elfhide, that is actually another myth. When you step back and look at the entirety of the genomes, the actual difference between humans and chimpanzees is closer to 4%. Now, 4% might still sound pretty small, but let me tell you, in genetic terms, it is an absolute canyon. Because that 4% difference isn't just a few swapped letters here and there. It creates an overwhelming haystack of genetic material. We are talking about approximately 35 million single nucleotide differences. That's 35 million individual letters of DNA that have changed. And on top of that, there are about 90 megabases of insertions and deletions, which are entire chunks of genetic code that have been either added in or ripped right out. Somewhere in those millions of tiny molecular tweaks are the literal keys to our species, the exact mutations that gave us everything from our upright walking to our complex spoken language. When you actually map out what's called the phenome, which is the observable, physical, reproductive, and cognitive traits that differentiate us from great apes,
you get a massive matrix like the one you see here from Varkey and Alfine's research. Look at this list. We're talking about everything from concealed ovulation and delayed childhood development to our bizarre ability to shed emotional tears, our vulnerability to certain specific diseases, and of course, our wildly advanced cognitive capacities. It wildly contrasts with that seemingly tiny 4% genetic difference. A relatively small amount of genetic code is doing a staggering amount of heavy lifting. And here is something incredibly surprising. Despite our extremely close relationship, chimps are actually terrible models for many major human diseases. Conditions that completely ravage human populations, like Alzheimer's disease with its full neurofibrillary tangles, or our incredibly high susceptibility to falciparum malaria, or severe complications from hepatitis B and C. They are often really mild or virtually non-existent in great apes. This is a massive biomedical paradox. Understanding our genetic divergence isn't just some historical trivia, it's absolutely critical to solving unique, life-threatening human health crises today.
Finding the genetic needles, the detective's toolkit. Let's dive into this next section to see exactly how scientists manage to hunt down the specific genes responsible for all these differences. To find the needles in this gigantic genomic haystack, researchers use a few downright brilliant strategies. One of the absolute most important is using what they call outgroups, like orangutans or macaques. Think about it. If you find a genetic difference between a human and a chimp, you don't instantly know which species made the change. But if you check an orangutan and its DNA perfectly matches the chimp's, bingo! You know the mutation happened exclusively in the human lineage. Scientists also have to painstakingly filter out regular background variations, and they focus heavily on major structural changes, like whole chunks of DNA that were inserted, deleted, or totally duplicated. A really major driver of our evolution comes from those insertions and deletions, which scientists call indels for short. While single-letter swaps in the DNA are super common, indels account for a massive chunk of that 4% difference we talked about earlier, specifically about 90 megabases of DNA. Imagine an entire paragraph being dropped right into or ripped right out of a complex instruction manual. That is absolutely going to radically change how the machine operates. You know, we so often think of evolution as gaining new things, but honestly, it's just as often about loss. Take the CMAH gene, for instance. Around 2.5 million years ago, a tiny 92 base pair deletion completely deactivated this gene in our ancestors. This loss completely altered our cell surfaces. It changed our susceptibility to certain pathogens, and it even changed how our bodies react to eating dietary meat. We literally became more human by losing a piece of our DNA. How wild is that? And this loss of genetic material is compounded by something called ALU elements. These are essentially short, highly repetitive stretches of DNA that have the ability to copy and paste themselves all throughout the genome. In the human lineage, these ALU elements expanded dramatically, up to 3 times more than they did in chimpanzees. By jumping around our genome like that, these little snippets heavily impacted our gene regulation. They acted kind of like newly installed dimmer switches that fundamentally changed how loudly or softly our existing genes were expressed. Candidate gene approach, working backwards. Let's flip the script. Instead of looking at the vast ocean of DNA hoping to spot a change, scientists can actually use a reverse detective strategy. A perfect example of this backwards hunt is the FOP2 gene. Researchers didn't just stumble upon it while browsing the genome. It was actually discovered by studying a human family with a severe inherited speech and language disorder. When scientists finally located the gene responsible for the disorder, they compared it to chimps and found 2 uniquely human-specific amino acid changes. Even more incredibly, genetic dating suggests this uniquely human version of the gene became fixed in our population less than 200,000 years ago. It was a crucial, literal biological stepping stone for the development of spoken language. Another totally fascinating clue found by working backwards is MYH16. This is a gene that produces a protein responsible for jaw muscle strength. In humans, a specific deletion actually broke this gene, which resulted in a significant reduction in our jaw muscle power compared to apes. Now, you might be wondering, why on earth is a weaker jaw a good thing? Well, weaker jaw muscles exert far less restrictive force on the skull as we grow. This perfectly aligns with our ancestors shifting to softer cooked diets, and scientists believe it may have physically allowed for the rapid evolutionary expansion of our brain case. These candidate genes like FOXP2 for speech, MYH16 for jaw muscles, or others that affect brain size, immune responses, and even our lack of full body hair
are unbelievable discoveries. But as Varkey and Althide point out, they are genuinely just the tip of the iceberg. Each one of these single genes interacts with hundreds of others in an incredibly complex biological symphony to produce what we call the human condition. And as we search through all these genes, we really have to catch ourselves and avoid being entirely brain-centric. It is so tempting to assume that the absolute secret to humanity lies solely in the genes that gave us our massive brains. But the fossil record tells a different story. It shows that maximum human brain size was actually achieved long before the emergence of modern human behaviors, advanced culture, and art. Think about it like a computer. Having the upgraded hardware doesn't necessarily mean you have the right software installed yet. This proves a really vital concept in genetics, the profound power of minor changes. We don't always need a massive headline-grabbing mutation to create a profound evolutionary shift. A seemingly tiny tweak, like a simple twofold difference in how a specific thyroid hormone-binding protein is expressed in the blood, could completely radically alter metabolism and brain development. Sometimes, the absolute smallest genetic whispers cause the loudest evolutionary echoes. So, what does this all mean? Ultimately, determining what really makes us human is a deeply philosophical question that the genome alone just can't entirely answer. Yes, we are descended from monkeys. Yes, our 4% genetic difference provides the biological blueprint, but humanness requires an incredible synthesis of biology, environment, culture, and cognition. The DNA absolutely gives us the spark, but what are we going to do with the fire? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I will leave you with that to think about.